Welcome to the afternoon session. And like this morning, we will take the first few minutes in preparing for recitation, for which we cultivate the merit field in the form as you feel comfortable with. If one wants to do it in a simple form, it could be invoking the presence of Buddha Shakyamuni in the space above ourselves. Again, while thinking of him, bring to mind the qualities, inner qualities. Think of infinite love, infinite compassion, which extends to all sentient beings without discrimination. Love and compassion conjoined with wisdom of realizing the ultimate nature of everything in the way they are. And how from that well of consummate qualities brought to full perfection give rise to these wonderful teachings, eye-opening, wonderful teachings born from his own experience, teachings that have been time-tested for centuries. By masters of all the lineages, towards whom we also generate gratitude, inspiration, and then visualize the presence of myriads of sentient beings, fellow sentient beings, all of them surrounding us. Think of the commonality we share with them, as well as of our interdependence, the indispensability of others in just about everything that we do, that we aspire to achieve, that we enjoy, starting from right at this moment, all the way to our full awakening. That these reflections give rise to a sense of affinity, empathy, gratitude, value towards others, a sense of indebtedness. Despite our confusion, despite our ignorance, our own failures, so with these reflections, going towards the Buddha and the lineage master, generating sense of awe in their achievement, and also a sense of hope that we could go the same path. And then reflections on the sentient beings, giving rise to even more stronger sense of love, compassion. With these cultivations within us, we'll now say the recitation together again with a felt sense of what the words we are saying mean to us.
I take refuge until I am awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and its causes. May all sentient beings be free of suffering and its causes. May all sentient beings not be separated from sorrowless bliss. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free of bias, attachment, and anger.
Sitting quietly, let's hold in our mind the aspiration of bodhicitta. Wishing to attain full awakening for the sake of all sentient beings. Somebody has very aptly described bodhicitta in this way. When it comes to thinking big, it can be nothing bigger than bodhicitta. It's the most worthwhile, altruistic, and noble attitude. Think about this for a while. It leaves out not a single sentient being within its purview of concern and wishes to benefit them to the utmost by striving oneself to attain full awakening so that there will be no shortage of any capacity, be that along the lines of genuine concern, genuine love, passion, and be that on the side of wisdom, insight, tolerance, all of the qualities. And yes, aspiring to attain the full awakening, aspiring that high, it covers all the rest of the aspirations to be of benefit of sentient beings in whatever way possible in the meantime. within such a mind set, within such a mental state, self-centeredness has not the slightest chance of ever popping up its head in for the shortest period. How expansive, free, open, giving one might feel with such a mental state. Taking clue from our own limited capacities of loving, being kind, or being knowledgeable, wise, insightful. Take delight in the fact that we have the potential to grow it further into full consummate level equal to that of a Buddha. And what comes in the way of developing that is nothing but the afflictions, which all of them, despite having a very unstable foundation in a misunderstanding, yet through our lack of taking any action, paying it in any attention, it has almost built a stronghold in the very core of our being, so much so that we have almost identified with it, and we don't see any way outside of it. But now is the opportunity for us to bring our attention to that and get to know the ins and outs of afflictions and what they do. Even the so-called function of the afflictions are nothing but their faults. That's their only function, to disrupt the peace and to generate non-virtuous actions that bring not just suffering in the immediate, but also in the long term, and also brings sufferings to oneself and others. We now have this aspiration to be of benefit to others in the truest sense of the word. We should be able to call their attention to their inner afflictions and be able to find the roots of their sufferings so that they become empowered by themselves in seeing through the faults of the afflictions and also finding their path to more and more lasting, genuine happiness. To be able to do so, we ourselves should be as conversant in the workings of the mind, particularly that of the afflictions, in all possible ways. Be that combating them indirectly or directly, or that of building the force of antidotes within us. So we will set our motivation for this evening's session together to utilize this time in making some strides in this direction of exposing the faults of afflictions, loosening their grip on us, and eventually paving the way for complete elimination of them. Okay, so in terms of approaching the topic of affliction, the scriptures are very much in agreement in how to strategize and how to approach this. And it makes perfect sense. First, we need to identify what are afflictive mental states and what are not. Just as we discussed in response to the question earlier this morning about what's the difference between afflictions and conditions like depression, anxiety, and whatnot. I see the disorders more like a symptoms or like a growth, outgrowth from the more deeper underlying layer of afflictions. And afflictions are very sneaky, crafty. They could come in different forms. They would have difficulty sometimes to really identify them for what they actually are. Nonetheless, they carry their destructive nature with them in whatever disguises they come. And if we identify them, then we'll be able to point our finger at the root of problems. And when we pull them off, we can see what a difference it makes in our way of relating to situations, in our effort to stay present and be able to tap on our potential for positive outlook and positive mental state, irrespective of what situations we may be going through. I said irrespective, and it is really, really doable, although it is difficult to come about easily, but we persist in our efforts. And yes, eventually one will begin to be really surprised in how one has changed over time in reacting or responding to a similar situation, which would have earlier, in older times, would have completely put oneself off. Sometimes we think that, afflictions are unavoidable. When such things happen, how come you cannot be angry? If given the choice, it is one thing to be so easily prone to afflictions through repeated habituation and having not taken any restraining measures against them, then yes, just like one has opened the floodgate for them to just run amok with the slightest triggers. But if we succeed, if we manage to kind of exercise restraint and not indulge in them, and easily, and then in the face of situations, try to stay very mindful and be pre-warned that this could happen, and thus take extra measures in kind of building the defense or barriers or afflictions, keeping them from coming. And yes, eventually we will see a change in our almost natural response to situations even. But to be able to do that, first and foremost, we need to identify what afflicted emotions are. I said it again myself. What afflicted mental states are. Because what we consider as afflictions are not necessarily emotions. Very often we find translations of the original Sanskrit term klesha or nyamong in Tibetan being translated as destructive emotion, afflicted emotion, almost suggesting that all of the so-called kleshas and nyamong are emotional in nature, but they are not. And this is a very crucial point in regard to understanding afflictions, because almost the more crucial roles of the afflictions are due to their underlying and cognitive components. So not just that, even some of the afflictions themselves come in the form not of emotion, but rather of cognitive mental states. And they have a very, very significant role in many of these cognitive factors or cognitive nature afflictions. Some of them serve as the very lifeline. All the afflictions, irrespective, to necessarily depend on. So it is good to study them and know them, be able to tell one apart from the other, among themselves as well as from others, from non-afflicted, non-afflictions. Maybe we will cover some other grounds during our discussion, so I'll not digress much. So identifying afflictions, as I said, they can be emotional or non-emotional. Intelligence in nature. Some are emotional in nature, some are intelligence in nature. They are kind of a limited intelligence, even involving certain investigation and arriving at not so smart conclusions about how things are, what not. And by way of clinging to them, they kind of really serve as the very lifeline or the very essential component in the afflictions. Likewise, as I said this morning, they are not necessary. Not necessary. All the afflictions are necessarily not virtuous, but they are not necessarily non-virtuous. There's no such thing as virtuous affliction. They can be contaminated virtuous actions that afflictions can contribute to, but the afflictions themselves are never virtuous. But what about non-virtuous? Are all afflictions non-virtuous? Neither is the case. So it is quite apparent here why I'm using these terms, and they really have very clear-cut boundaries among them. They mean differently. So they are not necessarily emotional. They can be those which are intelligence in types. They are not necessarily non-virtuous. They can be neutral afflictions, but never is any affliction a virtue or virtuous one. And yes, as we mentioned earlier, they are definitely different from the mental actions. I will say mental actions. They are more like the triggers or the motivators of the mental actions, just as they are for the physical and verbal actions, but they themselves may not be counted as actions in the schema of how the scriptures lay out these structures. But nonetheless, even just being at motivation, being at that motivation level in which they serve a very crucial role, even there also some can be non-virtuous by very nature, some not, but nonetheless afflictive and destructive. So we will go into detail about this, a little, not too detailed, we have just one day. Covering the topic of affliction in one day will be, again, going our usual way of saying, afflictions may be not too much of a problem, don't deserve that much of attention. So once we have identified afflictions, what kind of mental states within us are afflictions? It is very essential, so that when we watch, we will be able to kind of almost pinpoint, name them. I mean, we can imagine how it would be very helpful if we happen to be in the garden and know plants, be able to name them. Otherwise, everything would look like same thing. But if we could know them for what they are individually, and then their functions, their own peculiarities, whatnot, there can be much to deal with them in a very, very appropriate and very, very effective way. Because the afflictions, they may share some conditions together, but then they have their specific characteristics given their different types, and that calls for different ways of dealing with them, different antidotes that can be effective to them specifically. That's how knowing the afflictions is very important. In the literature of sea learning that has now picked up its popularity and momentum, and is used in so many different countries, in many schools, whatnot. They call this in emotional intelligence. Again, they call it emotional. If they necessarily include just the emotion, that's fine. But if that means afflicted emotions, then it's not a complete picture. But nonetheless, they stress the need of identifying them, recognizing them, so that we know what the problem is, what is making us uneasy, what is creating it. It could be a mixture, it could be one. So if we could really identify them, it will make a big difference. Yes, now I have anger. Now I have this thing, I have this thing. Anger in general can be easier to understand, but the subtle subdivisions within it may not be that apparent unless we have the tools to recognize them. If we recognize them and identify them for what they are individually, then we can reach out to our toolbox of antidotes, and then pick up the right toolbox and tools to deal with it. It will just match with it and can be able to deal with it. But if we reach out for something else and just guess what might work for it could take longer. So, okay. And then, since we don't have much time, I'll take time in going through them one by one, so that even if we do not get to exploring them fully, we would have already covered them in general. So, seeing their destructive nature, it's quite interesting. In the scriptures, it deliberately calls their functions as well as false. What their functions are faulty in nature, faulty in the nature in the sense that they are destructive. And in this regard, I want to say that sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes it may seem like afflictions, particularly like anger, others, people think like they are needed, they are necessary, and without which we cannot accomplish our goals, whatnot. Particularly, it is quite common in the circles of activists who think that yes, anger, not quite hatred, but they say anger has its wisdom. It is the only tool that made them stand up against injustice, whatnot. Maybe here we are using the same term, anger, for different affliction, or not, but I suspect that is the case here. But nonetheless, if we do not keep our eye on that and the tendency of it growing into hatred, into a much more full-blown, very destructive, negative emotion, just merely saying this is what is necessary, whatnot, it could take us on a very, very different ride later on and find ourselves totally out of control. That is, so there is that aspect of when we speak of afflictions, really no very similar ones but different ones, very apparently different ones, but at core very similar ones. So that kind of a sophistication in our knowledge of identifying the differences is very essential, very helpful. But what I was going to come to was, even if a particular affliction may seem like what has brought one to a accomplishment of something or whatnot, it calls for us to look at how that journey felt like, what were the risks, whether that was the only option, whether resorting to an affliction was the only option in accomplishing the means, in accomplishing the goal, whether something could have replaced it and delivered a much, much more sensible, long-lasting, least damaging effect. So those are things to bring up and consider while dealing with these issues. So seeing the destructive nature is very essential. When we see the destructive nature of something, the more we dwell on that, the more we become repulsive of it, the more we become put off by that, the more we generate a sense of caution against that. So, and in this regard, merely seeing it for one time, two times is not enough. One has to kind of double down on really seeing the falls of the afflictions on a regular basis, particularly drawing from one's own examples, whatnot, so that the message could go deep down and sink in, thus develop a sense of caution, at least a wish that it didn't happen or it didn't occur, and a wish that I do not fall into its trap. And then eventually, with persistent efforts, one will become more skilled in even sensing it before it actually comes. Even if it has occurred, one could see how one is not buying into the story totally, and that itself deflates the force of it, and it will shorten its length, and thus the destruction, all of that. And then eventually we'll be able to really be able to almost replace what would be the usual place of anger with love or compassion and whatnot, and thus be able to deal with the situation at the same time, yet with much more beneficial outcome from that, and much more enjoyable process in doing that, and least damages. But for that, seeing the destructive nature of afflictions is so crucial. One has to kind of build the list of how destructive they are, in what ways, and kind of run through that, run through that list. And that way, a stance of caution against them. Unless we have a sense of caution against them, we will not be ready to take any measures against them. We wouldn't see anything wrong with them, right? And then, once we identify them, we see their destructive nature, we will wonder how they are generated. What is the process, general process, specific process in which they are generated within us, how they occur. And then that's speaking of the sequence of the process. And then on top of that, we also want to see what are the causes and conditions that give rise to it. And what are the options by which we can dodge, we can avoid falling for those conditions, whatnot. And then eventually, once we come to know how they are generated within us, what are the causes responsible for them, then we have a good grip on how to tackle the afflictions, knowing it's very scientific. It's very scientific in terms of finding the causes, and these need to be tested on one's own experiences. And once we verify them, we can be very, very sure where we should put our fingers on and deal with. And then once we know that, then to a great extent we would ourselves be able to figure out what would be the antidotes, what are the measures we could take against them. Knowing what they are caused by, we'll be able to match up an antidote against each one of them. Knowing how they are generated, we will know at what point we could intervene and change the course. Even if we are so far away from totally rooting out the afflictions within us. But nonetheless, even given that base still strong with us, we will be able to deal with other as essential factors and thus be able to intervene in the process and not succumb to the afflictions. So that's the idea behind this layout here. So let's move to the next one. Yes. What is affliction? It is difficult to really, what is affliction? In the scriptures also it has explained it. It has come up with a definition. In the scriptural understanding, particularly when we approach it through the systems of debate and discussion and whatnot, coming up with a clear-cut definition is considered very essential. And if we could come up with one, then that can be very, very helpful. But it is not always easy to come up with that. So in the Tibetan, it says Raptu Mashiva Cheva. Sometimes people would just easily explain this as something that disrupts the peace, something that makes you unhappy, that brings in unease. Those are fine, but they do not help in really pinpointing or separating afflictions from non-afflictions. Because there can be many other factors that could be as disrupting of the peace, of the ease, or bringing in some unhappiness, whatnot. But that's not necessarily what afflictions are. So in the Tibetan, we call that Raptu Mashiva. It has a connotation of doing the work at a deeper level, not at a surface level, but on a deeper level. And the function being that of Raptu Mashiva. All I could come up with my very limited English is Raptu Mashiva Jeva, that utterly ruffles the mind. Or borrowing from more used terms as subduing, taming the mind, something that keeps the mind from being subdued, something that keeps the mind from being tamed. So this is a little different from making the mind not in peace, creating unease, like that. So the succinct definition that I've attempted to translate here is an affliction is that which utterly, or is that mental state, or is that mental factor which utterly ruffles the mental continuum upon occurring in it, upon occurring in the mental continuum. So that immediate function of that would be to ruffle the mind of its stability, of its deep-seated, of its state of stability. And then this function of ruffling it happens at a more core level, at a more deeper level, not at the surface level. So in explaining this Indian master Jinaputra, Javesebo, he has expanded it a little bit, having the nature of making one's mind, mental continuum, unsubdued, untamed, is a general characteristic of affliction. That's the definition. And in terms of how that is done, there are 6 ways for that to happen. One is due to a distraction, due to wrong understanding, due to mental excitation, due to delusion, and due to lack of conscientiousness, and the lack of integrity and consideration for others. By the way, when we are saying lack of integrity and consideration for others, these 2 are very crucial and very destructive afflictions, crucial for generating not just afflictions, but even non-virtuous mental states. And in Tibetan, they are Ngosa Mepa and Tel Mepa. They are translated very differently. But here, what it is a mental lack of a mental restraint against unbecoming actions, be that in consideration of oneself or in consideration of others. So there's this sense of a carefree sense when it comes to non-virtuous actions. There's this opening of the floodgate to engage in whatever negative actions it may be, without any consideration of how it might make me look, how it might make me stand in relation to what the principles, the values I uphold. And likewise with the other one, that of no consideration for others, almost like no lack of modesty, lack of any kind of a restraint against unbecoming, non-virtuous actions, even in regard to how it might adversely affect others, how it might make me look to them, etc. But then these other ones are distractions, wrong understanding, mental excitation, delusion, lack of conscientiousness. It's quite tricky here because they themselves, most of them are afflictions. So maybe they are pointing out to how this unraveling takes place, not because of these as a cause, but because of these occurring within us and being the very foundation for the unraveling of the unsubdued, untamed nature to happen. So this is like the general definition, but it will be easier for us to look at the examples, and then from there we can find out. Can we move to the next one? Yes, in the scriptures, it comes out with 10 so-called rude afflictions. And this is mostly in doing with the Abhidhamma cycle of teachings. That's where most of the materials about afflictions come, but at the same time, and yes, most of what these literatures say are kind of upheld by just about all the schools of all the levels of schools within Buddhism. Here I'm not talking of school in terms of different traditions, but rather in terms of the general gradation of fine-tuning of the understanding of reality and everything. So across that ladder, the general layout schema is accepted, except with few changes in here and there. More particularly in the context of ignorance, there is a big shift. Big shift, so much so that ignorance, despite being not just an affliction, but even the root affliction, is not anymore confined to being just a mental factor. It can be a whole collection or conglomeration of the mental states. Anyway, so some of the afflictions that we recognize, such as jealousy, greed, they are not in the list because they are subsets of any one of these afflictions, or they are a product of a combination of 2 or 3 of these. So that's how it makes this array of afflictions. In the scriptures, it speaks of 84,000 afflictions. And because of that, we speak of 84,000 heaps of teachings that Buddha gave. Heaps of teaching, not in a physical heap or physical text or volume, but more in the sense of a complete teaching to deal with that specific affliction at all levels of it, to the subtlest root of it. And it's interesting, in the time of Buddha, these teachings have been tested to individuals, or I should say, Buddha used his teachings, used his insight in dealing with these afflictions on individual beings who are more prone to particular afflictions, in whom certain afflictions they have of great proportion. So there were many examples, many instances of beings of extraordinary beings of afflictions of one particular kind, of a great intensity, and towards them he taught these teachings. So it seemed like the teachings to this extent of 84,000 have been identified based on those incidents as well, and on top of the general principle of how afflictions rooted in what we usually call the three poisons. Here, ignorance, attachment, and anger would usually constitute the three main, the 3 poisons, out of which all the rest would come out. But here, in explaining the afflictions, even the very basic structure has been explained in this way. And one reason for this, I see, is when we come to explain, or when we come to divide up the whole obscuration of afflictions into 2 categories, broad categories. Of the obscurations, the afflictions, or rather, let me just call them simply as afflictions. 2 groups within afflictions. One that can be eliminated during the path of seeing, and the one that can be eliminated during the path of meditation. By the way, it is only during those paths that afflictions can be dealt with in a most thorough way, namely uprooting them, rendering them irreversible. All the measures before then would only go so far and fall short of uprooting them. That's why, in terms of the path or the antidote that can uproot them, it only comes down to only these two out of the all 5 paths: the path of seeing and the path of meditation. And between them, the entirety of the afflictions are divided up. In a way, not so much. Okay, we can say divided up. Okay, we can say that. So in that context, in laying out what the afflictions are that are eliminated during the path of seeing, and what are the afflictions that are eliminated during the path of meditation, there this list of 10 afflictions can come handy in really making sense of the full distribution of it. So there, this particular layout comes handy. Otherwise, we could as well speak of all the afflictions being rooted in the 3 poisons, and from there we can kind of speak of the proliferation, if you will, or that of its expansion. By the way, when we speak of the 84,000 afflictions, it's mainly on the basis of speaking of the 3 root afflictions. So we'll look closely to these afflictions. And as I said earlier, in this list of 10, the first 5, can be considered emotional in nature. The later 5 that I have are not emotional in nature, they are intelligence in nature. And in a way, out of the first 5, pride could be mostly intelligence in nature, not emotion as much. But if we include that in the emotion, it will be 50-50. So it's very important to remember that yes, afflictions can come both in emotional forms and also in cognitive forms. So let's look at the individuals a little bit. So these are non-view. So yeah, another way of calling these afflictions is the first 5 are non-view, which means non-intelligence, emotional, and the remaining 5 are views, types of view, intelligence in nature. So here I'm using the term anger interchangeably with hatred. And that's because of how in Tibetan, even in the scriptures themselves, they present 2 terms which are interchangeable, and in usual parlance, we use anger for that other name, but in essence, it's the same as hatred. But definitely, very clearly, in the Western psychology, in the Western world, you make a whole different distinction between anger and hatred, and they definitely are in the way you understand it. But here I'm just alerting you to this usage of the term anger. It could be hatred here, it's hatred here. So attachment, it is an obsession about body, possession, etc. And its function is to engender suffering. Suffering here engenders suffering in a very specific form, because attachment, among all the afflictions, aside from the ignorance, has a very big role in our birth into cyclic existence, in our birth into this kind of a state of existence under the influence and under the direction of afflictions. It has a very specific role in activating all the samsaric karmas, right? Samsaric karmas including the contaminated virtuous ones. And that's the reference to the suffering. So the entire, not just suffering in a gross painful sense, but more deeper in this condition of being in captivity or in bondage, or being bound in the shackles of the afflictions. Anger it is malevolence towards sentient beings, dukkha, conditions of dukkha, so unsatisfactory nature, conditions of unsatisfactory nature, something that you fear of risk, plunging oneself into suffering. Its function is to give rise to the wretched state and misconduct. Wretched state more so in the sense of, as soon as it arises, one finds oneself in a very wretched state. One's body is disturbed, one's mind is disturbed, no question about it, but one's body is disturbed. And in terms of it disturbing the mind, it's quite apparent in the case of anger, how totally skewed perception you get of whatever the situation may be, person or situation. And that puts one in a very wretched state, in contrast, in conflict with the reality. And just from the get-go, it is kind of ready to take us astray. And misconduct in the sense of how, under its influence, the actions that come out would be very, very unbecoming. But the reference to the term malevolence, I don't know exactly what in English it may convey otherwise, but what I take it to mean is it has to have some deep-seated element in it, in where the hostility, sense of hostility should come. It has a deep-seated, it's not just on the surface, kind of easy to go off, but easy to wash off, but rather kind of deep-seated, something that is lingering over time. And that's very clear in terms of grudges. When you hold a grudge, it's not on the surface, it really goes deep, right? And you carry it everywhere, even while on travels. And these afflictions can travel without visas. And they do not weigh anything, so no custom detects it, but it can feel very heavy. The pride here, it's an inflation of the mind in comparison with others or in a particular situation, but mostly in comparison with others, based on the view of personal identity. So this is the way of calling a view of personal identity, but we use it in a very specific way. We'll be able to unlock this in the next category. The reason why I was saying that it tends more into the view side is because in pride, the view of personal identity in the sense of seeing oneself almost in an independent state vis-a-vis our aggregates is very prominent. It's very prominent. The moment we question who we are, more particularly in relation to our aggregates, to our body, mind, whatnot, we begin to see how the idea of a self-sufficient, kind of a in-control notion of I kind of fizzles out. But until we investigate like that, the natural tendency, impulse is to see that there is an I which rules over the aggregates. That is almost like usually the analogy we use here is that of master and the servants, having this sense of being in control. Being in control to the sense that you are not dependent on the servants, on the subordinates, whereas in reality you cannot do without them. But to that kind of a notion, it appears like it is able to withstand. It is able to sustain itself without depending on them, and it has a status of being in control. So that kind of a sense, inflated sense, that kind of a misconstrued sense of who we are in relation to our aggregates play a very important role in all the afflictions, but more particularly in the case of pride, it is more of a bulk of it, what makes pride. And that's why it tends more into it tends more into the group of, to belong to the group of views. Its function is to give rise to an attitude of contempt towards whoever you may be comparing yourself with, and in relation to which you have this inflated sense. And suffering, of course, it will then bring in suffering. Here, the usage of the term ignorance is little different than the higher schools, like that of the Prasangika Madhyamikas, but here is more of an absence of knowledge, not of a misknowledge, but absence of knowledge. I use the term for truth here, but in a way it can be more general for truth, not specific to the Buddhists, right? But for truth in the sense of what are the actual cause of suffering, what are the actual cause of freedom from it. And that is not necessarily exclusive to Buddhists. And the lack of knowledge with regard to what are the actual cause for suffering, what are the actual cause for happiness, will lead us astray and will keep us in dark in terms of how to accomplish these deep-seated wishes within us. So when presented from a Buddhist perspective, it would all look like it's specifically saying the Buddhist take on this, but I don't think that is the case. Otherwise, calling these afflictions would be very, sectarian, and also very not so, universal. So when we speak of four truths, I think it's mainly a question of whether or not one is able to identify the actual causes leading to suffering, actual causes leading to happiness, and so failure to do that and being in the dark about this is the ignorance. Likewise, it will extend to other realities of the world. That is applicable to everyone, irrespective, whether or not we understand things in those categories, in those groups or whatnot, but the deep down message is applicable to everyone. So everyone, irrespective of what one's affiliation of religion is, if we do not know the actual cause of suffering, we would suffer irrespective of how much we wish to be free from it. So that's what I think is alluding to. Its function is to provide a basis to the defilement. Of course, when you do not know, then yes. When you do not know, it's like you create a space for anything else to come in. Yeah, and thus all the mistaken views can fill in, and thus lead to unmistaken conclusions, doubts about the teachings, or doubts about the reality, doubts about doubts about the teachings, authentic teachings in terms of how afflictions happen, how sufferings occur, whatnot. Now here, diluted doubt, qualified as diluted, which means doubt as such, doubt per se is not included in the afflictions. But diluted is some doubt that tends more to denying the reality. That's considered diluted. There could be neutral doubts, there could be, equally kind of open doubts about things, unsure. But those that necessarily do not make afflictions. But here, diluted in the sense of doubts that leans more towards denying the reality. That is called diluted. So from here we know that doubt per se is not an affliction. Likewise, fear per se is not an affliction. Of course, fear can always have, any kind of a fear can have its own toll in making us unstable and needing to do something, being in a hurry and whatnot. But at the same time, not every one of them is deluded. Of course, fear is something to be overcome after all, but at a certain given time, it can be something to be cultivated so that one could then make the progress, confront it, cultivate it, and progress and transcend it. Of course, fear is something to be overcome. At the time of Buddha, at the time of Buddhahood, there will be no fear whatsoever, even the so-called positive ones or cultivatable ones. But nonetheless, fear per se is not affliction, because there can be fear there can be certain fear that may be beneficial to be cultivated and to be endured, and then eventually transcended. Okay, so that gives us some idea of these afflictions, right? So these are all pointing to mental states, and technically speaking, to mental factors as opposed to mind, but mental factors. Because when we speak of mental factors, then we are speaking of specific modes of mental events. Mind as such is a very general mental subjective element, subjective dimension, but within that, the split nuances of them can be called mental factors. Within them, some can qualify for afflictions and some into non-virtues and affect. So these are interesting things to see. At least it gives us some kind of a ready list to work on and check for ourselves whether they stand truth for us or not. But these are also works of beings, masters who have spent years and years, decades and centuries in exploring the inner world and have come up with from their own experiences, almost in a very scientific way, except the laboratory happens to be inside. Okay, let's move to the next one. Yes, so this one is quite interesting, quite important, and usually when we speak of afflictions as just emotions, this whole category, which is 50% of the root afflictions, are left out. That's very essential. Out of which the first one is very crucial. As I said earlier, all of these 5 so-called view type afflictions or intelligence in nature type afflictions, they all share in certain qualification, which I have listed in the case of the first one in those bold letters. It is an endurance, inclination, discrimination, clinging, and outlook in viewing their respective objects. So in the case of the first one, in viewing the aggregates as I or mine, its function is to give basis to all kinds of false views. Here it says the 5 aggregates as mine, as I, right? So another way of looking at this in a more convenient way, I think, would be not seeing the aggregates themselves as I or mine, which is one way of having this view of personal identity, particularly in line with the Prasangika, the highest Prasangika Madhyamika view. The other way is seeing an independent I, an independent mind in relation to the aggregates. So basically, this notion of allowing that there is an I which is separate from the aggregates, separate to the point of being independent of them, to the point of being a controller in regard to the afflictions, not the other way around. And and having kind of a more in an advantage status with regard to the afflictions, not seeing them to be interconnected or interdependent, and not leaving any room for one being more prominent than the other, but rather being interrelated. Instead, if we see ourselves as being almost kind of pointable and palpable within the aggregates, then that's kind of alluding more to this kind of a view with regard to oneself. The emphasis with regard to oneself is so crucial because the afflictions and the resultant sufferings, they happen within us. And they happen within us through this lens of seeing the world in relation to oneself. Depending on what kind of a notion one has of oneself in relation to the others, as well as more particularly, immediately, in relation to our afflictions, it will make a big difference in how we relate to the world and how we are affected by it. So it's because of this fact of how we filter everything through the lens of who we are, who oneself is. And because of that, this emphasis so much on identifying this view within us, which is incongruent with the reality, and playing a very crucial role in giving rise to all the other afflictions, because all the other afflictions within oneself happens or occurs in relation to how things, in the context of how things relate to oneself, and then filtered through this misconstrued view of who oneself is, it will then give rise to these afflictions. So that's why this relationship between this wrong view being more at the root or the base level in regard to the afflictions. So there's emphasis on really checking up what kind of a notion one has of oneself in relation to the external world, but more so in relation to one's aggregates. And dependent on that, we would have as informed or misinformed or underinformed perception of who others are. And likewise, we kind of then spread that misconception to everything. So the qualities of endurance, these view type afflictions share in these qualities of being in endurance. I'm just relying on these terms, but the terms themselves may not be that self-descriptive. But what it means is, when it comes to endurance, which means that kind of a notion has some sense of, some sense of enduring enduring the risk of being wrong, kind of being more persistent and obstinate against the possibility of being wrong. So kind of a sense of pushing, kind of being obstinate and obsessed with it, and being ready to kind of hold on to it, even in the face of being pointed out as wrong, something like that. So that's what the endurance part is. Inclination is that aspect of kind of a adherence to it with an element of buying into it, with an element of buying into it, in being sync with it. Discrimination here is this element of endurance and inclination comes because one has reached in many cases, one has reached to these conclusions of how one views oneself by deliberately, intentionally engaging in some kind of analysis. So there's this element of discrimination or analysis involved in there, and that's where one is gaining some sense of some sense of being right, being unmistaken. So that's, though one is wrong in what sense one has arrived at, but nonetheless that is led through a process of investigation. In the case of gross, in the case of the remaining three, the last three afflictions, it's a case of pursuing an investigation in a more intentional, more intentional, gross way. In the case of the first two, it's more subtle, but nonetheless there is some element of investigative work involved there, and that's what is breeding this sense of obstinacy, in the sense of being right, and this accompanying sense of kind of buying into it. And then the clinging part is kind of then, that's what feeding to hold on to it. And then the outlook is, that's how one sees things to be. So I called it outlook, but the text itself calls it view. View in the sense of viewing the world, viewing oneself in those lights. So that those qualities is shared by all the rest of them, except they have this specific, specific mode of their apprehension, specific mode of their notion that they hold on to. The first one is the view of personal identity. In the case, and it has degrees of subtlety. At a grosser level, that all the Buddhist traditions as well as schools of philosophy agree to, is that of seeing the person as being independent and being in control in relation to the aggregates, not kind of enjoying, not in a equally important connected relationship, but that of a master over the subordinates. And that's the more common one. The more subtler one is that of seeing oneself as being inherently existent, not necessarily in a position of being in control. At least that's how I see it. Not necessarily in seeing itself in being in a position of control or being in a position of being more independent, but nonetheless seeing the self as well as aggregates, likewise all the things, having some kind of a intrinsic self-enclosed identity of its own, within the view of which all possibility of interaction or dependence is ruled out, at least within that view. So it is in those regards that they serve as the very foundation of all the afflictions. In some cases, in all of the cases, it's the very foundation of all the afflictions. But then in some cases, the proportion of that, its involvement, its presence is much more, like we saw in the case of pride. Now the extreme views. So it shares in those aspects in regard to what it views to be true, and the specific mode of that is it views the self, the object of the view of personal identity, as eternal or annihilated at death. So basically seeing that based on that view of identity, personal identity. So here we are using the term view of personal identity in a very, very specific form, not view of personal identity as the words suggest. We have to revert, we have to go back to the first one, where as I explained, although the text itself kind of focuses on seeing the aggregates as I, it would be more as seeing I in relation to aggregates as being independent, being in control vis-a-vis the aggregates. So the second one is based on that kind of a view, and based on that kind of a view, yet at the same time falling into either of the extremes of either seeing that such a person having this vantage point against the afflictions is either eternal or that it ceases with death. So falling into either of the extremes. And that's what the extreme views refer to. And what it does is, if we hold on to such a view, it prevents the prospect of being liberated from the clutches of the afflictions, because both of these views come in the way of understanding the middle way view. And that's why it prevents of. So it prevents liberation by means of the middle way. And then the third, fourth, and fifth, they are all what we call acquired. Acquired in the sense that they are all learned in I guess in each individual lives, not something that you carry over from a previous life, but something that you build the momentum in a particular life through education, through specific deliberate attempts. So they are called acquired. In the case of the first two, it can be both acquired and innate. So the third one is that false views, a perverted view as the best. So basically, a false view that you hold as not false and being the highest, eminent, the supreme. So that kind of a wrong projection towards a mistaken view. And because of that, it keeps one from ever looking deeper into it, probing through it and finding it wrong, and thus being stuck in it. And that breeds other false views to grow from that. And then the fourth one is in regard to practices, rituals, rites, or even conducts, whatnot, which may be slightly misguided, misdirected, whatnot, but one is blinded in seeing that and kind of is insistent in sticking to that. And that means engaging in certain things which would not lead to the intended fruit. So that's again a case of getting the law of causality skewed in regard to certain practice that one sees as promising to lead to a certain state of being. And then the last one is wrong view. It's either negating the cause and effect in general, or the relationship between the actor and the action, or rejects certain other realities. It's then kind of an outright rejection, very outright, deep-seated rejection of reality. And as I said earlier, we would look at cause and effect in terms of karma, but I kind of see it as not karma as Buddhists understand, or not karma as a Buddhist business, but rather to do with causation in general. and within that, the causation involving volitional actions and the resultant sufferings, whatnot. In a way, the same law, same reality affects everyone, and irrespective of one's affiliation to a particular philosophy or tradition, whatnot. So that's how I see this to be universal rather than specific to a particular religion. But what it does in terms of the function is that it can be really a stumbling block in one's cultivation of virtues. And instead, it could lead us astray into cultivating non-virtues. And thus, they have their very, very devastating effect on the prospect of joy and happiness of the person. But such gross, skewed views is not something that we carry over lifetimes, but something that we acquire through our own affiliation, training, misguidance, like that. Even to this day, we have schools that would advocate afflictions as a means of achieving the goal. And some really very fervently believe in them. Those would be considered cases of such wrong views, because it's quite evident that this leads to more suffering to themselves and to others. And because of that, and then in terms of the motivation and all of those are very intact, and even stronger in this case of miseducation, because of the belief that they are so brainwashed to the point of being so blindly into it that all momentum of making it the grossest of the afflictions, the grossest of the actions can be present in there. So I think most of the time is consumed here. Let's see what the next slide says. Okay, that's good. Okay, that's good. So now is the time to double down on the faults of afflictions. This one says part 1, because this deals with this life. So this has no Buddhist business in here. It's everyone's business. So one has to see whether these are true or not. And then more particularly, not just in principle, not just in general statement, but true to one's own experiences. It enslaves. This is the destructive nature of afflictions in general, not specific to any particular affliction, anger, jealousy, greed. Those could be looked at separately. Afflictions, they kind of take over our mind and they enslave us without our choice. Not only without our choice, but also it limits the options, right? It enslaves us in the sense that it kind of completely takes over us. And the greatest casualty of afflictions taking over us is our intelligence, our faculty of discernment. It disrupts peace and calm immediately. I said immediately. The moment it arises, the mental stability is disrupted. Even in the case of attachment also. The moment it happens, it not in that dramatic way as anger would have done, or in some cases even that attachment can also do it, but most of the time it will do it in a very sneaking way. But right then and there, if we watch or we kind of replay the video, then we can find how the stability has been right away disturbed. It distorts perception of reality. That's very true. Under the influence of the afflictions, we get very distorted perception. We get everything photoshopped. We get to see things in a photoshopped way. And that's what we only get to see because photoshopped, right? And we are carried away by that. So we will be mostly exaggerating, fabricating on the reality, but in some cases even underestimating also. Triggers misinformed reaction because it has taken us away from reality. The action that we do in following that would be as skewed, right? Just from the very get-go, we'll be taking a misstep or facing in a wrong direction, thinking that we are going there, but we have already shifted, faced on another direction. It sabotages capacity for discernment. As I said earlier, yeah, the worst casualty that it creates is on our faculty of discernment. So that's the most valued quality, most valued asset that humans have over animals. But when we are caught in afflictions, then that's the first one that it gets it. And we can see how, looking back, we couldn't believe that we had behaved in that way. That's a clear indication of how our discernment has been compromised. Undermines capacity for positive response thereafter, even if afflictions have subsided. Yeah, the manifest affliction is gone, but its residue, influence, or grip is still lingering. So much so that one still has difficulty. Even if part of your mind says that, okay, smile or light up, even if it says, you have the part of it saying, yes, light up, smile, you don't need to be that, you don't need to be sulking, right? But still, you just cannot get yourself to do it because you still have the lingering influence of it. Although it has manifestly gone, but still undermines capacity for positive response thereafter, unpredictable and self-defeating. That's very clear. Once anger takes over, once we are directed by Mr. Anger, Mrs. Anger, Miss Anger, whatever, or even monk anger, non-anger, yeah, then we are unpredictable. We are kind of really taken for a ride by the affliction. Now we have no control, no sense of where we are going, what it will unfold. Usually that happens with wars and with other fightings, all of those. It starts from a very small thing and then out of the blue. Venerable has been sharing this story of how some couple, right, went to the movie who had left their first child to be cared for by someone for the very first time. And the parents were very, very worried, so they were calling the nanny often, and then it disturbed someone in the movie. And that happens to have a gun with them. And then in that interaction, things got out of control and the guy shot the person. So one becomes totally unpredictable, right? And that's the case with many occasions, most of the occasions when we kind of deliberately buy into or allow ourselves to be angry a little bit, somewhat, then the moment it takes charge, then we are out of the scene. It runs the show. Self-defeating, very easily self-defeating. And this is more apparent in the case of jealousy, and from there we can apply to all others. We may have meant to be at peace, to be more peaceful, to be more happy, whatnot. That's what we do. In everything that we do, we are driven by this aspiration, rightful, justified, fundamental aspiration to be happy and whatnot. But we end up being more suffering, more painful, more in misery. It's all self-defeating. And that the very purpose for adopting it, for resorting to it, is defeated. In the case of jealousy, that's very clear. Scriptures make it clear, and it's very apparent. We want happiness, but we are jealous of someone else's achievement that they have worked so hard for, with all of the efforts, and all we are presented with is their achievement, their ultimate outcome. And here we are jealous about them and therefore suffering. Instead, we could have just celebrated their achievement, given all the hardships they have undergone. On our part, there was nothing needed, just a ready result there for us to rejoice into it. That way, it will only augment our happiness. But instead, we either knowingly, unknowingly, deliberately, either not, choose to be jealous and suffer ourselves. This is quite this case with all of the afflictions. Many of the afflictions are short-sighted and they seek instant gratification. No time to wait. Just now. That's so short-sighted and can be very blinding, very blighting. Of course, if you are very indulgent in anger, jealousy, greed, all of this, even the relatives and friends will distant from you. They will feel not that trusting of you. And then, yes, when we give vent to these afflictions, whatnot, every moment we give rise to them, the momentum builds within us. The grip of them, the strength of their disposition is intensified. And very often, one affliction leads to another, not just of the same type, but another type. So the proliferation, they are like the machine, the factory. They can generate more afflictions. So this is just one way of doubling down on the faults of afflictions within this one short lifetime. Now when we consider many lives after, then they are even more drastic and more grave faults. So with this very strong effort in really doubling down on the afflictions, thereby making this decision that yes, afflictions are not even the last option, not even the last resort. They are no resort at all in any given situation. Right? So in the meantime, it may not be that easy to pull it off right away, that sense of common sense, that sense of what is right for oneself. But if we dwell on this and look at it from one's own experiences and develop a strong conviction in it, then yes, the next moment, the next time we come across the same situation, we would definitely see a slight shift in how we react to the situation. And over time, that will build up. So with this good note, we will stop here. What number of slides was this? Okay, everybody has, whoever wants, have the slides. So I had put in 22. I don't know how many we have got. But at least we came upon the destructive nature of them. Okay, we'll dedicate our merit. This has been an affliction bashing session. Very well deserving. Okay.
Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their sufferings. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. Before everyone leaves. Oh, okay. Except for Gishel. So I wanted to take a minute to talk to you about something that's near and dear to my heart, and that would be the Abbey. I've been coming here for quite a while, on the level of decades, pretty soon here. And I wanted to talk about generosity, but for me, that actually begins with gratitude. And I wanted to express first my gratitude to you for being here, because this is one of the signs that the Dharma and the teachings are flourishing in the West. And so, thank you. I'll start right there. I have gratitude on so many different levels, because when you participate in the Abbey retreats and teachings, you help support the growth of the Sangha in the West. And you do that, when you do that, it helps support the growth of compassion, love, and peace in the world. As the Sangha grows and develops, we are able to see that this environment is a way for the Dharma to be pure and to flourish and to be shared freely with no charge whatsoever to anyone. And so I'm very grateful for your contribution just by showing up. I'm grateful for the people who have come for all the years, because selfishly, I'm able to keep coming. And their contributions in the past have helped build the facility and support the growth of the Sangha's knowledge and their ability to study and practice. And so you can start to see that through the past, we help ensure that the Abbey is here today. And through the present, we help ensure that it's here in the future as well. So just think about your participation as a way to give this kind of domino ripple effect into the future as it spreads farther and wider. And when we come here, we get answers. Why am I miserable? Why am I depressed? What is causing this? And we find that, the afflictions are a major culprit there. But not only that, but how can we deal with them? And one of the antidotes is gratitude. It's a way to soften our hearts in our own suffering, and to move through the world so that we can be an envoy of peace instead of an envoy of someone who spreads anger in a time when we need to reduce it and cool it as much as we can in every corner of the planet. So if you feel that sense of gratitude yourselves and want to help spread the Dharma in the future and the present, you can give with a monetary contribution. But if you're a little short there, as I find myself at times, you can give prayers, you can give a mantra, you can offer service, or you can simply take the teachings and apply them where you go back into your homes and your lives. And that is one of the biggest gifts of all, of course. So I'll just end again by thanking you. And may these teachings bring you some happiness and relief from suffering.